Hey gang, Chonky here. Happy New Year's. Today is going to be part 5 of Liberty's Crusade Abridged. We're going to be going over chapters 9 and 10 today. So just to give you a little recap of what happened in the last video, we had our first instance of Mike Liberty really meeting Arcturus Minsk, and they decided to team up. Mike Liberty will write some news coverage for the Sons of Korhal, not necessarily like a propaganda piece, but more of like a promotion of the good that they're trying to do in the Caprilu sector and save humanity, whereas the Confederacy is more so using everybody as test subjects, you know, against the Zerg, against the Protoss. They're bad people. And in order to have Mike write this news coverage for him, Mike would like help saving Jim Raynor, who is currently being held aboard a ship called the Merrimack in orbit above Mar Sara. So Mike takes some of the Sons of Korhal, and they're able to rescue Raynor without much issue. They have the skeleton crew on the ship. And the moment Raynor is rescued, Minsk wastes no time in sinking his teeth into the resourceful character that is Jim Raynor, and has Jim and Mike Liberty, although Mike doesn't go because he was told to, he goes to protect Raynor, but they go to the Jacobs installation to retrieve a data disk and find the Zerg there as well, being kept in cages, being studied, perhaps being bred. Who knows what the Confederacy was doing. And as they are leaving the Jacobs installation, they get back on board the Hyperion, which is Arcturus's flagship, and they witness the Protoss fleet enter the orbit of Mar Sara, and they decimate the planet. They begin blasting it from orbit with these energy beams that just punch through the surface, and magma just starts spilling out everywhere, and you know that everybody's just going to die, exactly what happened on Sara. And the last thing we see is Minsk telling the pilot to take him out of orbit and to leave, and Raynor is just dead inside after seeing his planet get destroyed. Chapter 9 is called Marshal and Ghost, and I'll go ahead and read you the Liberty Manifesto. James Raynor was the most decent man I ever encountered during the fall of the Confederacy. Everyone else, I can safely say, was either a villain, a victim, or quite often both. At first wash, Raynor seems like a backwoods cowboy, one of those good old boys that you see in the bars swapping lies about the days gone by. There's a cocksureness and overconfidence about him that just makes you bridle initially. Yet over time, you come to see him as a valuable ally, and dare I say it, a friend. It all comes from belief. Jim Raynor believed in himself, and he believed in those around him. And from that belief came the strength that allowed him and those who followed him to survive anything else the universe threw at him. Jim Raynor was a most decent and honorable man. I suppose that's why his is the greatest tragedy of this godforsaken war. So chapter 9 starts out. We're still on board the Hyperion. We've left the orbit of Mar Sara, and Liberty is kind of thinking about Minsk as he is as a person, and because Minsk is still a mystery to Mike Liberty, and he's trying to decipher him to see how well he can be trusted, because even though Mike has only known Minsk for a short time, he still knows of him and his deeds through the propaganda put out by the Confederacy, although he doesn't know what's real and what isn't. But he says that for all the ghosts that haunt Minsk, his motivations don't seem very ambitious. He seems like the lowest ward healer on Tarsonis. He was still just trying to gather his power, unwilling to pass on any potential ally. And it was because of this fact that he knew that Minsk would do everything to keep his word to at least people like Mike and Raynor. And to that note, Minsk promoted Raynor as captain, as Raynor is kind of sticking around with the Sons of Korhal for now, and because of his deeds at the Jacobs installation, and, you know, destroying the infested command center, even though he wasn't with the Sons of Korhal yet, Minsk has saw fit to give him a promotion. So along with this promotion for Raynor, Mike finally gets to have an actual sit-down interview with Minsk, which is something that no other journalist has really had the opportunity of doing. Partially because Minsk hasn't wanted to do an interview with anybody but Mike Liberty, because he knows that Mike is a honest-to-goodness journalist. So as Mike is interviewing Minsk, he's finding that he finds himself agreeing more and more with Minsk and his opinions on the Confederacy. That through it all, it was more of a criminal bureaucracy, filled to the brim with career politicos and grafters whose battle cry was, "Where's mine?" And it's very fitting. You know, everybody just kind of is looking out for number one. They don't really care about the greater good. And then Minsk also mentions that the UNN, which is the Universe News Network that Mike works for, they never ran anything on Mike's report on the destruction of Mar Sara or the Confederate culpability in the attack. And it's almost like everything is just kind of being brushed under the rug, a big hush-hush, just like what happened with Chow Sara. However, aside from avoiding conversation about what happened on Mar Sara, the Confederacy has finally opened up and confessed that there are, in fact, not one, but two dangerous alien species out there, the Zerg and the Protoss, and that they are responsible for all of the destruction that's been happening. And the only solution is to group together, huddled under the Confederate flag. That's the only way that humanity will survive, apparently. Such is the nature of tyrants, said Minsk. Minsk and Liberty are sitting on the Hyperion's observation deck during this interview. They both have a snifter of brandy. Minsk hasn't touched his, but Mike talks about how he long drained his and was wishing that it had more in it. And while they were also drinking and doing this interview, they were also playing chess as sort of a battle of wits. And while they played back and forth amicably, Mike commented that he almost always loses in chess against Minsk, which is, you know, no surprise. Minsk is a bit of a strategic kind of guy. He's very much a mastermind. He's incredibly intelligent. It is, there is a funny note that Liberty talks about how Minsk has an ashtray sitting on the table for Mike, and then Mike is lamenting, saying it's funny that he put this here because I've given up smoking again. Even though we know he's just going to start smoking the first chance he gets. But in the midst of the chess game during this interview, Minsk continues and says, "Tyrants can only survive by presenting a greater tyrant as a threat. The Confederacy does not realize the danger of the other tyrants that is now called down upon all of us." And then Mike interjects and says, "Before the Zerg and Protoss, their favorite threat was you." And Minsk chuckles and says, "I must admit that I feel that the best form of government is benevolent despotism. I don't think the oligarchs in charge agree with that." And then Mike interjects, "And are you pointing at greater tyrants to cover your own abuses?" And then Minsk agrees, saying, "Of course I am. But it does help that our foes are greater tyrants than we are, or ever intend to be." So it's during this interview that Mike notes that he has seen nothing of Kerrigan the last few days. And he does bring it up to Minsk, whose only reply is, "My trusted lieutenant works best in the field." So Mike just takes that as Kerrigan is sowing the seeds of rebellion, hoping to get more people to the Sons of Korhal's banner. And he was right, as 2 days later, Minsk called both Liberty and Raynor to his observation deck, and the moment both of them are on the deck, he immediately cuts to the chase. Antigua Prime, border colony of the Confederacy of Man. Its people are very, very tired of the Confederate military, which has gotten a bit heavy-handed since the Protoss and Zerg first appeared. I want Captain Raynor to help the Antiguans get their revolt off the ground. That means dealing with a unit of Alpha Squadron they've got babysitting the major road on the ground. Raynor, ready for action, just says, "My pleasure, sir." And Mike notes that Raynor, since the destruction of Mar Sara, now seems a lot calmer, he's more controlled. And while he's happily accepted the new role as captain in Sons of Korhal, he's also begun incorporating his own men, the militiamen and his own boys, into the Sons of Korhal. And it's all kind of helped everybody see through the loss of their own planet and sort of band together in this time of war. And then Minsk, hearing Raynor's affirmation of duty, looks at Mike and says, "And Mr. Liberty, if you would like to accompany this unit." And then Mike cuts him off and says, "You may have overlooked this fact, Arcturus, but I'm still not working for you." And then Minsk just kind of coldly replies, "Well, you're not working for anyone in this moment, it seems. The UNN has been noticeably devoid of your illustrious presence. I only thought that you would be professionally interested, and," says Mike, And your glib tongue and clever notepad might be enough to encourage the Antigans to cast off their shackles. And then he just kind of smiles because he knows that Mike is a sucker for praise. So everybody's going planetside, and Mike is reflecting on the studies that he did on Antigua Prime. He talks about how it used to be a water world, but long before the Terrans got to the Caprulu sector, a lot of the oceans had dried up, and now all that remained were hard mudflats and low flat mesas covered with a native shrub that had some purple blossoms. It was just kind of like an ugly planet. It's not very beautiful. But there were a lot of bones everywhere, like creatures that had died and settled into the ground have been uncovered over the last few thousand years of erosion. But overall, this sort of dried out planet was very pretty in an arid, lifeless sort of way. So the dropship drops Mike, Raynor, and some of their boys off on this low plateau, and they set up a defensive perimeter around the ship just to make sure that they can establish a comlink and make everything as smooth as possible. They've been told that the scout is in the area and they're supposed to rendezvous with them, so they're not sure exactly who it is. And the moment the comlink is set up, Kerrigan appears out of nowhere. Remember, being a ghost, she has active camouflage programmed into her combat suit. So she just kind of pops up right next to Mike and Raynor and snaps off a quick salute, saying, "Captain Raynor, I've finished scouting out the area, and you pig!" And then, because this is all from like straight out of mission number 5 in the Terran campaign. And Mike immediately turns and looks over at Raynor because, they're talking over comm units, and I guess when Kerrigan says, "You pig!" it like peaked the microphone a little bit. And Raynor also is just kind of like, oh, like he gets struck back because it surprises him. And he's just kind of dumbfounded because he doesn't know Kerrigan's a telepath. And says, "What? I haven't even said anything to you yet." And then Kerrigan's wide lips turn into a very nasty sneer and says, "Yeah, but you were thinking it." And then Raynor says, "Oh, yeah, you're a telepath." And then the moment he realizes that, it says he shoots Mike a look and gives him a sneer that says, "And you didn't want to warn me about any of this?" And then he continues on with Kerrigan and says, "Look, let's just get on with this, okay?" To which Kerrigan kind of laughs because, it's Kerrigan. She says, "Right. Well, hey, the command center is a couple clicks due west, up on one of those mesas. Alpha Squadron is there, but no Duke. Sorry, boys. We take them out, and the indigenous forces will be willing to rise up in rebellion. There are some towers that need to come down if I'm going to get in." And that's in reference to the missile turrets that you see along the way, because they are detectors and can detect stealth units. So, it's important to take them down so that Kerrigan can sneak in undetected. So Raynor, still frowning after, getting outed for being a pervert, he says, "Right. Well, I guess I don't need to tell you to move out, Lieutenant." And she replies with, "No, you don't. But there is one other thing." And, Raynor, still salty, says, "Go ahead, Lieutenant. I don't read minds. Please tell me." And she says, "There have been increasing reports of xenomorphs in the area." And she kind of, smiles a little bit, but this makes Raynor frown, incredibly deeply. He does not like to hear the sound of that. And so Mike cuts in, he says, "Xenomorphs? Like Zerg, they're here?" And she says, "Cattle mutations, mysterious disappearances, bug-eyed monsters, the usual suspects. Not a lot, but enough." And so then Raynor kind of thinks to himself, he says, "Crap. Confederates and Zerg? They seem to go hand in hand. Okay, now let's roll out." So now they leave their little defensive perimeter around the dropship to make a move on the Alpha Squadron units. And they note that the dried mudflats on Antigua Prime are just absolutely lousy for cover, but they're good for speed. So what they end up doing is they see a couple Marine scout parties walking around, and Raynor ends up distracting them because he has his Vulture hoverbike. So while he scoots around and blasts them apart with grenades, Mike, Kerrigan, and the rest of the Marines sneak on by. They don't want them to actually know that there's a military force making their way towards the space. And as they get near to the Alpha Squadron base, the group becomes under fire, and Mike immediately calls out for help and assistance. As Kerrigan says that they've got sensors out the butt cheeks, and she can't sneak in while they have all their towers set up. And so Mike calls out to Raynor on their comm system, says, Raynor, it's Liberty. We're pinned down. We need your firepower. Muy pronto. I don't know why he says 2 Spanish words right here. I don't know why at all. But he asks for help from Raynor and doesn't hear anything, and he's worried that the comm lines have been jammed or damaged from the enemy control towers. But just moments after he says they need help, he hears like the whine of the vulture. And it says that Raynor jumps off of a ledge nearby, like lands on the ground, skids to a stop just outside of range, or just outside of view of the enemy's like control tower, because it has guns on it in the book. And before the tower can turn and train its guns on Raynor, he starts firing grenades into it from the vulture and absolutely decimates it. And blossoms of flame erupted at the base of the tower. And so now that the tower's down, Kerrigan and all of the troops that were pinned down, they roll out and they just start firing the remaining survivors and shredding them apart with spike fire, it says, because remember the Gauss rifles just shoot spikes. After they take out this little encampment, they're moving on towards the rest of the Alpha Squadron troops, and Raynor takes off and privately hails Mike and says, next time, make sure it's something important, buddy. And then, drives off on his vulture to look for more scouts. And Kerrigan, despite being a telepath, I guess, didn't hear it or, whatever, but she says, what did he say? Never mind. He's a pig. But at least he's a pretty competent one. And then Mike, wanting to compliment his best friend in the whole wide world, says, Captain Raynor is one of the most upright, moral men I've met since leaving Tarsonis. To which Kerrigan replies, yeah, he's that way on the surface. Everything's under real tight control. It's underneath that he's a pig. Like most people. Trust me on this. And Mike, not knowing what to say because he's talking to a telepath, just says, well, he has been under a lot of stress lately. In which Kerrigan laughs and says, yeah, well, who hasn't? And as they're having this conversation, they get within sight of the Alpha Squadron command center. And Mike compares it to the last command center he saw, which was infested by Zerg, and how thankful he is that this structure does not appear to look like a shrunken apple, and that it's actually like up and running and just manned by Terran. So as they're making their way towards the command center, Raynor hits up Mike and asks for all of the reinforcements and Kerrigan to join him. And Kerrigan agrees. She's like, yeah, send them over to Raynor. I've got to get inside. And I can do that either with or without the support troops. They're just extra targets. Send them off. I'll catch up with you guys and follow when I can. So Mike orders the rest of the Marines to go meet up with Raynor. And Kerrigan, puts on her hood and gets ready. And then Mike is about to, ask her something, and he sees her just touch her belt. And then, boop, it says that she vanishes. No, not quite a vanish. There was a ripple around her. One that you could follow if you knew what to look for, and looked very hard. The guards at the front of the command center did not know what to look for, and were not looking hard enough. There was a burst of unseen canister fire, and the guards blew apart into a couple pieces each. Then an explosion at the main gates, which suddenly yawned wide. There was a silhouette among the smoke for a moment, a female figure with a large gun, and then she was gone, into the depths of the enemy command center. After Mike watches Kerrigan completely decimate these guys and, infiltrate the enemy base, he starts sneaking forward to catch up to Raynor and the rest of the men, and he just gets really jealous because he doesn't have any cloaking technology. And as he gets towards the entrance of the command center, he looks down at the dead Marines that Kerrigan just blew apart, and he's thinking about how they're wearing Alpha Squadron uniforms, and he kind of laments for a moment. And even though they're there to do a job, he tells himself internally that whatever happens, he doesn't want to see any of these Marines without their helmets off. Because remember, he traveled with the Alpha Squadron for 3 months. And these could be people that he knew, could be people he had fun with, that he particularly enjoyed. We know that Swallow's dead, and we know that he doesn't like Colonel Duke. But he met hundreds of people, at least hundreds of people, on board the NORAD too. And so he's just kind of really lamenting the fact that people he could have been friends with are now dying at the hands of his new friends. So he sneaks past the bodies and goes into the devastation of the command center, and he comments on how easy it is to know where Kerrigan had gone. He just followed the path of broken and bleeding corpses. Men and women in full combat rig had been tossed around like ragdolls, and now lay crumpled in pools of their own blood. And then this brings his memory also to Lieutenant Swallow, and that he was so sickened by the sight of Swallow after she had been ripped apart by the Zerg inside that claims office. And now, after just a short amount of time with the Sons of Korhal, he is very much getting used to the sight of dead bodies. And maybe now, for better or for worse, he has begun growing the necessary emotional armor to survive in a universe at war. He continues forward, so Mike continues on, and he finds a toppled Goliath walker that has Kerrigan's canister rifle jammed through the windshield. And the moment he gets into the next room, it says he was rewarded with the privilege of watching Sarah Kerrigan fight. It was blood poetry, war ballet. She had reached the center of the command center now, armed with a knife and a slug thrower. She would wink into existence, slit a throat, then wink out again. Marines would rush to that location, and she would appear a few feet away, firing a burst point blank into the helmet of her target, and then gone, and then back again, this time with a spinning kick that broke the neck of a bellowing officer. Mike brought up his weapon, but found that he could not fire. It was more than just a reluctance to take human life. He could not tell where she was at any one time, and through it all she moved with a cat-like grace and determination that shredded every opponent she encountered. And then he comments, she was very good with knives. More importantly, she was like the Protoss, glorious and deadly. So yeah, Mike is just standing in the doorway to the central room of the command center. He's just watching Kerrigan massacre all these guys. But only once everybody is dead does Kerrigan blink back in and stay visible, and she just collapses to her knees, absolutely exhausted. And so as she's like sitting there exhausted, Mike reaches for her to try and like comfort her, and he says that his hand never reached her, and the moment he gets close, without hesitation, Kerrigan spins around, grabs his wrist, twists it very violently, and brings a knife up to his throat. And only when the tip of the knife was inches from Mike's face did she realize that it was Mike Liberty, and her face was a mask of rage. Fear flooded into Mike's mind, and in an instant, he knew that she was aware of that fear. And then, she stumbles back a little bit and just says, "Don't do that! You're afraid of me!" And then she, drops the knife, and you can tell that that really stresses her out, because you can only imagine how much fear she feels from the people that she murders. Because she's very good. She's like one of the deadliest people in the Terran sector. And I mean, I can't even imagine the sort of terror that floods her mind from her victims. So having it happen with Mike, who she's, starting to develop a bit of a friendship with, is very hard on her. And then, but Mike, taking it in stride, because she just panicked and said, "You're afraid of me." He hesitates and then just says, "Yeah, you betcha." And she apologizes, says, "I'm sorry you had to see all this." And then he takes a deep breath and just says, "I just never visited you at work before. Don't worry, you rest for a moment. I've got to kick off a revolution." So Mike runs over to the comms desk, shoves a corpse onto the floor, because of course there's just a dead person just bleeding out on the buttons and controls. And as he takes a pre-recorded disc and enters it into a slot, he grabs the mic and broadcasts a general message across all channels. He says, "This is Michael Liberty, broadcasting from Antigua Prime, with a report that the Master Command Center for this world has been disabled by rebel forces. Repeat, the Master Command Center has been disabled. The power of the Confederacy has been interrupted, and there is a strong possibility that it can be shattered entirely if the people of Antigua rise up to take control of their own destiny. The Confederate Marines in charge of the command center are either dead or in full retreat. While rebel losses have been," and then he looks over at Kerrigan, who's just weeping because she just killed a bunch of people. "While rebel losses have been minimal, we have a message here from Arcturus Minsk, leader of the Sons of Korhal. Please stand by." And then he hits play on the disc and lets Minsk's message play out to everybody. And then after that, he walks away from the desk as the message begins broadcasting Mengsk's sultry voice. He walks over to Kerrigan, who's now stopped crying, but she's still just like shuddering. And he says, "It's okay. You got them all." And she says, "I know. I know I got them all. And as I killed each and every one of them, I knew what they were thinking. Fear, panic, hatred, hopelessness, breakfast." Breakfast? One of the techs had skipped breakfast, and he was really regretting not having had waffles. And then this like makes her chuckle a little bit. He was about to have his throat slit, and he was worrying about waffles. Ugh, it sucks being a telepath. And then she kind of like starts running her hand through her hair. And all Mike can say in response is, "Yeah, I'll bet." And he is very aware that he is still afraid of Kerrigan, and that she could slit him tip to toe in an instant before he could react. And of course, Kerrigan picks up on this. She says, "I know that you're afraid, and you can admit it. That makes you smarter than most. God, what I went through to become this. What the Confederates did to me. Do you know? I know that the Confederacy has a lot of deep holes to hide their secrets in. Deeper and blacker than I ever imagined. Ghost training was for an elite group of carefully controlled telepaths." And then Kerrigan nodded as he continues. "Controlled through drugs and threats and brutality until they owned you, body and soul. They are no better than these Zerg creatures, creating warriors for a larger empire. We have no lives but the ones the Confederacy allows us, until we are no longer useful. And then we are discarded, lest we create future problems. Unless you escape. Or someone helps you escape." And then as he says it out loud, he realizes that, oh, maybe that's why Kerrigan is working for Mengsk. She owed him her life. And then all he has to do is think it, and Kerrigan knows it. So she nods her head and says, "Yeah, there's more to it, but yes." And then as they're having a wonderful, tender moment, there's some heavy thudding footprints in the entrance of the command center's center area, and it's Raynor. He's like, "Are you children okay?" And then Mike just says, "We're done here. Center captured. Message delivered." And then Raynor replies, "Good, because we've got a chunk of Alpha Squadron coming up from the south, and we're going to need all the help we can get handling them. Is she okay?" And then Kerrigan gets up. "I'm fine. You can talk to me directly, you know." And then Raynor, still being a sassy bitch, says, "Maybe I'll just think it at you." And then Mike, knows how much pressure Kerrigan is under, says, "Jim, come on, man, that's enough." And then Raynor just, "What?" Like, he's just trying to have fun. And then Mike reiterates, "That's enough." And then, taken aback, because Mike is very serious right now, Raynor just nods and says, "Yeah, I suppose it is." And then he looks at Kerrigan and very honestly says, "I'm sorry to offend, ma'am." To which she replies, "I'm used to it, Captain. You said we had more Confederates to kill. Let's get a move on." And then she shoves her way past both Mike and Raynor. And then Raynor, being a man, shakes his head and just says, "Women." Oh, I'm Raynor. "Women." But then Mike, softens his tone a bit and says she's been under a lot of stress lately. And then with that, Raynor, Kerrigan, and Mike all leave the command center. And it says, above them in the darkening sky, there were other flashes of another battle. They danced across the sky like new stars, and ended only when a brilliant meteor streaked across the sky, splitting the screaming atmosphere in its wake. And that is the end of Chapter 9. So Chapter 10 is called The Wreck of the NORAD 2. And the NORAD 2 is one of my favorite missions in the Terran campaign. It was a very big turning point for me when I was a kid playing the game. All of a sudden having to rescue Colonel Duke, or General Duke at this point, but spoilers. Anyway, here's the Liberty Manifesto. There's an old Earth word. It's called schadenfreude. The feeling of elation that comes from learning of the suffering of others. Like when you hear that a rival newsman suddenly was caught cursing in front of a live mic. or that a particularly corrupt alderman just stepped in front of a garbage truck. An elation accompanied by that twinge of guilt for feeling so good, and the quiet, fervent prayer that something that bad never happens to you. With the Protoss and the Zerg biting deep into Confederate territory, we had Schadenfreude in buckets. So, at the start of Chapter 10, we have resolved the conflict on Antigua Prime. They've mopped up the Alpha Squadron units, and it says that while other men and women went to war, Mike returned to Minsk's base and monitored the flow of communications. And he starts describing how he just hears all of these different communications. Most of them were anomalous reports. There's several calls from civilians just asking for help from anyone on any side just to be rescued. Lots of reports of monsters suddenly appearing in the countryside, as well as rebels taking advantage of all the chaos. And constantly, more and more reports come in, more numerous by the hour. And this just further added to their beliefs that the Zerg were on Antigua. And once they're certain of it, Mike immediately feels dread in his heart. He says that a Zerg presence was as good as a cancer diagnosis, only much more fatal. And until they figured out how to defeat them, the Zerg would eat the planet alive. Or the Protoss would show up, and through fatal chemotherapy, would sterilize the planet to keep the Zerg from spreading. And then Mike thinks out loud and says, "But it doesn't work that way, does it? A few cells always seem to escape, and the cancer just keeps growing." And as he's sitting there with this fire and fury in his belly, there's a message that replaces that anger with amazement. And it absolutely just shatters Mike's current train of thought. "This is General Duke, calling from the Alpha Squadron flagship, NORAD 2. We've crash-landed and are being hit hard by the Zerg. Request immediate backup from anyone receiving this signal. Repeat, this is a Priority 1 distress call. This is General Duke," and it's just a distress call that's on a loop. And then Mike mentions that he can hear other channels immediately pick up and ask for confirmation if it is in fact Duke. And Mike hears reports of Protoss in the area as well. A couple of their golden ships, but there's even reports of Protoss ground forces appearing. And there's a lot of noise, jumping around between the channels, but nothing that resembles an honest, solid offer to help General Duke. And Mike thinks to himself, he's finally cooked. Old Duke's goose is finally cooked. And then Raynor just immediately storms in and says, "Mike, come on, you're with me. Suit up, 10 minutes. And then Mike says, "What's going on?" And then Raynor's like, "You didn't hear the news in here?" And then Mike's like, "Well, yeah, the normal panic and despair, and oh, yeah, I heard Duke finally got promoted to general. Should we send him a fruit basket?" And, Raynor brushes it off, says, "That's funny, Newshound. Minx wants us to go in and rescue him. He thinks Duke would make a good ally." And then Mike just kind of sits there in bewilderment and says, "I'm hearing things, right?" And then Raynor hands him his helmet and says, "Come on, that's what I said." And then Mike is still just putting on the helmet. He's like, "And Minx wants me to go? It's news I can cover from here." And then Raynor says, "No, it's me. I want you to come along. That bastard locked me and my boys up. I'm going to want someone there who he's willing to talk to." Which Mike interjects with, "Did I mention the last time I talked to him, he had me forcibly ejected from his bridge?" Which is true, because he was yelling at Duke about how he needed to publish the right story because Duke was obviously hiding things about the Protoss and the Zerg. To which Raynor replies with a laugh, "It's come up, but at least I'm sure you're not going to shoot him right away," which Raynor might. And then Mike looks down. He still hasn't put his helmet on. And he starts following Raynor, and he just says, "Oh, man. Oh, I really want a cigarette." And then Raynor hears him and says, well, maybe you can bum one off old Duke." And then Mike, ignoring it, just says, "Oh, does Kerrigan know about this?" Yeah, she does. "And she thinks it's a good idea?" "Actually, she's the one who called Minx crazy. So you two finally agreed on something. I'm amazed." And then Raynor's like, yeah, I guess we did." So as they get to where the rest of the troops are, Mike comments that Minsk has been rallying his troops under a banner, and they're now ready to barrel across the flats, along with, and they're now ready to barrel across the flats of Antigua Prime. Their forces have been boosted considerably, because they have the Sons of Korhal, all of the Antiguan rebels, and there's even been some Confederate stragglers who abandoned their ties to the Confederacy, but were able to keep their weapons and pledge their loyalty to Minsk. It says that Raynor rode at the left side of the flank with a flight of Vulture hover cycles, so he's got a whole bunch of... He's got a little biker gang going with him, and overhead there's a bunch of A-17 Wraiths that are just, you know, like flying through the sky, getting ready to take down some aerial units, and Goliaths are marching as well. Like, they mobilized quite a force to go save the NORAD too. And it says almost immediately they were met with resistance from Zerglings and Hydralisks, spattered on all sides, like bugs on a windshield. And the air was filled with both the organic cannons, now known as Mutalisks, and creatures that looked like jellyfish brains with lobster claws. So those are the overlords. So yeah, they're trying to make their way to the NORAD 2. Obviously, this is mission number 6, I believe, in the campaign. And yeah, you just have to punch through the bases, the 2 Zerg bases, to get to the NORAD 2. It says that through the constant fighting, they plowed through the Zerg forces, routing some, eliminating others, and a group of Zerglings erupted from the ground and took out a full unit of Marines before the Vultures arrived and laid down a blanket of withering fire. The Zerg would fall back, and then return in greater numbers, and then fall back again. Mike relates it to, it's as if they're fighting against the sea. The waves beating back, but it was all just an illusion, because the tide would come in, and it would return with greater force. Mike just knows in his heart that Antigua Prime is doomed now, and that it's going to suffer the same fate as Mar Sara and Mar Sara, and be absolutely decimated by the Protoss. And as they repeatedly push the Zerg line back, Mike comments that at one moment it stiffened for one last second and then broke again, and the humans were through, heading for the uplands where the NORAD 2 went down. So at one glance, Mike can tell that the NORAD 2 will never fly again. The engines are just absolutely destroyed and mangled. The landing struts have been ripped off and are mired in the mud. The ship's forward bridge just kind of is hanging off like it's broken. And there's just nothing but devastation all around the structure. So Mike and Raynor both are driving Vultures. I don't know if I mentioned that earlier. But they drive around the starship until Mike is like, there, right there, we can get in that way. And the moment they get on board, since Mike is incredibly familiar with the starship, he begins leading Raynor towards the bridge. And it says that it was as if Duke had never left the bridge. The silverbacked gorilla was still hunched over his station in his armored hide. The only change was the number of screens around him that showed nothing but static, and a cascade of fiber optic cables draped along one bulkhead. He turned to the newcomers and scowled. "You're about the last folks I expected to show up." "Yeah, we love you too, General," said Mike. And then he pushes his way up and punches in a communication code from Minx's base. "What's this all about?" And then Minx says, "It's a word from our sponsor. It feels like years since I last said that. Does anybody in here have a cigarette?" As he's saying to Duke and the rest of the people on the bridge. Then it says on the main screen there's a static, scarred form of Arcturus Minx that begins to come into focus. And then he didn't think it was possible, but Duke's already nasty scowl gets even deeper, because he immediately knows who Minsk is. They have a bit of a history. So he says, "What's your angle here, Minsk?" And then Raynor immediately just like put off. It's like, "Our angle? I'll give you an angle, you slimy Confederate piece of..." And then Mike, "Easy, Jim." Which is not how it goes in the game. It's Minsk that cuts off Raynor, but here it's Mike. And then Minsk cuts in after Mike calms down Raynor. It says, "In case you haven't noticed, the Confederacy is falling apart, Duke. Its colonies are in open revolt. The Zerg are rampaging unchecked. What would have happened here today if we hadn't showed up?" "Your point?" "I'm giving you a choice. You can go back to the Confederacy and lose, or you can join us, and you can help save our entire race from being overrun by the Zerg." "You expect me to answer that? I don't think it's a difficult question. I'm a general, for God's sakes." And then Mike interjects. He's like, "Oh yeah? Congratulations on the promotion. Shall we put it on your tombstone?" And then Minx cuts him off on screen. "Michael, please. Duke, you're a general without an army. I'm offering you a position on my staff, in my cabinet, not just some backwater post where they shelved you before the war." "I don't know." Mike says that he's wavering a little bit, but Mike already knows that this means that Minsk has his hook in Duke, and he just doesn't know it. He just doesn't know it yet. Don't test my patience, Edmund. And then there's like explosions in the background because they're still battling the Zerg outside. And then Duke, takes a deep breath for a moment, and then finally, all right, Minsk, you've got a deal. You've made the right choice, General Duke. Captain Raynor. And then Raynor, yes, sir. Because he's like, he hates Duke. So he's, yes, sir. Escort the General's supporters and equipment to a safe location. And as Minsk is giving this order, Duke begins programming the NORAD 2's self-destruct sequence. And in about 20 minutes, the whole ship is just going to go nuclear. So they got to get a good distance away. And then it immediately cuts to the aftermath. They're back at Minsk's communications center. It says that with the explosion of the NORAD 2, there had been a lull in the fighting now. The Confederate troops, including the nearly resocialized ones, had switched sides easily with official permission. And now the only enemies to deal with were the Zerg and the Protoss. But the only downside is that there was no shortage of these enemies. They were only showing up in more and more numbers. So Mike wraps up his report on the NORAD 2 and shoots it into the internet. Whatever the internet looks like in the Kaprillu sector, Mike just sends it out there and then hopes that it gets published. And then he reflects. It says he leans back and he runs his hand through his hair. And unfortunately, his hair felt thinner than it did before. So maybe all this stress is finally getting to Mike. And while he's sitting there, a pack of cigarettes, slightly crushed, drops onto the console in front of him, followed by a foil container of matches. And it's Raynor. And he says, one of the crew of the NORAD says, you're even now. And then Mike, without dropping a beat, says, yes, excellent. And then just lights a smoke immediately. And then Raynor just says, oh, are you sending another report to nowhere? Because, Mike's stuff isn't getting published. And Mike replies, oh, I thought Kerrigan was the mind reader. But yeah, old habits die hard. Though I have the fantasy that someone finds these reports years later and appreciates all the sacrifices of the men and women against these things. And all the stupidity as well. So Raynor sits down next to Mike as he lights his cigarette. And he says, unlikely. Like Mink says, the victors write the histories. Losing memoirs are deleted, like yesterday's data. And then Mike takes a big old drag of the cigarette and ugh! Like he coughs and makes a nasty face. Says, oh God, what did they marinate this cigarette in? Cat urine? And then Raynor's like, sorry man, it's the best I could find given our circumstances. It's the story of our lives. And Mike, yeah, you betcha. Speaking of the Uber Minsk, how did you talk with Arcturus go? Oh, I told him that Duke was a snake. And then Raynor sighs. And he replied that he was our snake, right? And then Raynor shook his head, agreeing with Mike, but also, all of this. And then he goes on, he says, I believe in Minsk's cause, though the Confederacy has to go. And he did get me out of the stir, but, man, some of the deals he's making, some of the things he's asking us to do. And then Mike, cuts him off. He says, don't go following causes. They'll just break your heart. When idealism meets reality, it's rarely reality that backs down. I've seen more good government types turn into political hacks than I've seen Zerglings. And I've seen a lot of Zerglings. So it says that there's a silence between the two men. And in the background, you still hear comm units going off about Mutalisks and Wraiths and Goliaths and Hydralisks and all the battle with the Zerg that's going on. And it's just always about death. They're always speaking incessantly about death. And then Raynor chimes in. Did I tell you I was married once? And then it says, the chasm of personal interaction yawned wide and deep at Mike's feet. And he just kind of is like, oh. It hasn't come up yet. And as he says this, he hopes that Raynor just doesn't ask him to talk about his own personal life because Mike is not ready to share. But he says, I was married. I had a kid. He was gifted, they said. And then Mike says, oh, I heard the quotation marks around that. Gifted like in ghost material? Psionic powers? Telepathic? Uh-huh. Sent him off to a special school. Government scholarship. A few months later, we got a letter. There had been an incident at the school. And then Mike talks about how he has heard of these letters and these incidents before. They're unfortunately as common as grass when dealing with telepaths. Another of the Confederacy's dirty little secrets, rarely broadcast. And so Mike just says, I'm sorry, man. Because at that point, that's all you could really say. Then Raynor continues on. Yeah, Liddy never recovered. She just sort of wasted away. And that winter, she went down with the flu. And afterwards, I threw myself into work. Found out I liked working alone. It's an easy trap to fall into, hiding in your work. And then as Mike says this, he looks over at the transmission button that he pressed to send his news report into space that no one's going to publish. Anyway, Raynor said, I wanted you to know. You may have thought that I was being hard on Kerrigan for being a telepath. And maybe I was. But I have my reasons. And then Mike replies, she's got her own problems, you know, like everyone else. And like no one you've ever met. You might want to cut her a little slack. Yeah, but it's kind of hard when she knows what you're really thinking. And then Mike continues. Yeah, but Kerrigan seems like a good soldier. She may be wound a little tight, that's all. And then Raynor. I think she's dangerous. Dangerous to the troops around her, dangerous to Minsk, and dangerous to herself. Unsure how to continue after that, Mike shrugs and once again reiterates, yeah, well, she's had a tough life. And then Raynor, you know, comparatively, and we've had it easy so far, Then Mike continues, all the more reason to keep an eye on her. Watch her back, whether she knows it or not, though she probably will. We all need guardian angels. So then they kind of, there's a pause for a moment between the two of them, and they shift their conversation to questions of what worlds were in rebellion, and what effect Duke's defection is going to have on the Confederacy, and if it might rally more people to their cause. And then finally Raynor gets up and takes his leave, and abandons Mike to the soft urgency of the communications room. And Mike looks at his half-empty pack of cigarettes, the taste of the first one, that strong cat urine flavor still pungent in his mouth, and says, hell, I guess around here, you can learn to tolerate just about anything, as he goes to light up another cat pee cigarette. And that's the end of Chapter 10. Thank you guys so much for watching. We are cruising through this book. I'm going to try and get the rest of the episodes out as quickly as possible. So maybe twice a week. It'll be a slightly irregular posting schedule. I'm also working on the prologue videos. I want to have those out. And then we'll do a big supercut of the Starcraft 1 story before we dive into Brood War. But anyway, you guys, thank you so much for watching. See you next time.